The classroom was eerily quiet, save for the faint tapping of Mr. Thompson's fingers against the chalkboard. The air seemed to hang heavy, as if the students themselves were holding their breath, unsure of what was about to happen. Malik Johnson sat in the back row, his hoodie pulled low over his forehead. He wasn't particularly popular in school, and that was fine by him. He had learned to keep to himself, to fly under the radar. But today felt different. Something in the air told him that today was going to be like no other day in his high school career. Mr. Thompson was the kind of teacher who loved to make a show of things. He wasn't known for being kind or compassionate, but rather for his sharp wit and penchant for humiliating his students in front of the class. No one dared challenge him, except for Malik, of course. "All right, class," Mr. Thompson began, his voice dripping with mock seriousness, "today we have something special for you." He turned to the blackboard and scrawled a problem so complicated that even Malik, with all his intelligence, couldn't make heads or tails of it at first glance. "This is the kind of problem that separates the thinkers from the followers," he continued, looking over the class with an air of superiority. "I'm not expecting any of you to get it, but we'll see who's brave enough to try." A few students exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to raise their hands. Everyone in the room knew what would happen if they failed. Mr. Thompson would pounce on their weaknesses, tear them apart with his biting sarcasm, and make them feel smaller than they already did. The pressure was unbearable. Malik didn't raise his hand. He'd learned long ago that being too eager to participate in Mr. Thompson's games could be just as dangerous as remaining silent. But he couldn't help the little spark of curiosity that stirred inside him. The problem Mr. Thompson had written on the board was beyond anything he'd ever seen before, and something inside him told him that this was more than just a math problem, it was a challenge, an invitation to prove himself. "Malik." Mr. Thompson's voice sliced through the silence like a knife. The class turned to look at him, and for a brief moment, Malik felt the weight of every set of eyes in the room. "I'm sure you can solve this. You've always been so confident in your unique abilities. Why don't you give it a try?" The words stung more than they should have. Mr. Thompson had a way of making Malik feel like an outsider, and the sarcastic edge to his voice was meant to do just that, make him feel like he was being set up to fail. But Malik wasn't one to back down. Not anymore. With a quiet sigh, Malik stood up. He could feel the heat of everyone's gaze, and he hated it. But he'd be damned if he let Mr. Thompson get the best of him. As he made his way to the front of the classroom, he caught a glimpse of Jamal, his best friend, sitting in the second row. Jamal gave him a small, encouraging nod. Malik returned it with a half-smile. Taking his place at the board, Malik stared at the equation. The numbers and symbols blurred together for a moment before his mind began to focus. He wasn't sure where to begin, but he knew this was his moment. This was his chance to show everyone, especially Mr. Thompson, that they were wrong about him. But as he stood there, trying to organize his thoughts, the room seemed to close in on him. Mr. Thompson's voice rang out again, this time with a hint of mockery. "Come on, Malik," Mr. Thompson taunted. "I thought you'd be all over this. What's the matter? Are you afraid it's too hard for you? Maybe this is one problem even you can't solve." The laughter from the other students stung, but Malik didn't let it show. He clenched his fists, trying to focus. The numbers on the board swam before his eyes, mocking him. He had always been good at math, better than most of the students in the class, in fact. But this was different. This was something new. Mr. Thompson continued his barrage. "Maybe we should just get the janitor in here to clean up the mess you're about to make, huh?" His laughter echoed through the room, and Malik's face burned with humiliation. He felt the eyes of his classmates boring into him, their expectations hanging heavy in the air. But Malik couldn't let himself crumble now. He had to prove them all wrong, even if it meant looking like a fool in front of the class. Taking a deep breath, Malik picked up the chalk and began to write. The numbers seemed to speak to him, whispering their secrets if only he listened closely enough. Slowly, carefully, he started to make sense of the equation, breaking it down into manageable parts. It was complicated, sure, but not impossible. But just as Malik felt like he was on the verge of solving the problem, his confidence wavered. The sound of Mr. Thompson's voice snapped him back to reality. "Not bad, Malik, but you're still way off. Maybe you should just leave the hard stuff to the real mathematicians." Mr. Thompson's voice was laced with derision. The room fell silent. Malik's heart raced, but he refused to give in. He had come this far. He couldn't let the teacher's words get to him. He continued writing, his mind racing as he tried to fit the pieces of the puzzle together. And then, just as the bell rang to signal the end of class, something inside him clicked. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Malik stepped back from the board, his eyes scanning the solution. He couldn't believe it. Against all odds, he had solved the problem. He had done it. The impossible was now possible. But as he looked up at Mr. Thompson, expecting some form of acknowledgement, the teacher simply stared at him with a mixture of disbelief and disdain. "Well," Mr. Thompson said, his voice cool, "I suppose you got lucky, Malik. But I'm not impressed." The bell rang, and the students filed out of the room. Malik could feel their eyes on him, but this time, he didn't care. He had proven something to himself today. He had defied the odds, and he hadn't even broken a sweat. As he walked out of the classroom, Jamal caught up with him. "Dude," Jamal said, his voice full of awe, "that was insane. You actually did it." Malik smiled, but his mind was already racing. This was only the beginning. He had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he could take on the world. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Malik Johnson had never fit in. Not in the typical sense, anyway. Growing up in the heart of a tough, inner-city neighborhood, Malik had learned early on that survival wasn't about popularity or fitting into the mold that others had set for him. It was about being strong, keeping your head down, and never showing weakness. But despite all his efforts to blend in, Malik's brilliance made him stand out. And standing out in his neighborhood, in a place where people had to work twice as hard for half the recognition, wasn't always a good thing. His mom, Felicia Johnson, was a force of nature, tough, loving, and determined to make sure her son had the chance to succeed in a world that often tried to knock people like them down. She worked long hours as a nurse, sometimes picking up extra shifts just to make sure Malik could go to school with a fresh pair of shoes or new clothes when needed. He admired his mom more than anything. She was the one person who believed in him even when no one else did. But the streets had a way of pulling people in, and Malik often found himself at a crossroads. On one hand, he had his mom's dream of success, education, and a future where he could break free from the cycle of poverty. On the other hand, his neighborhood was full of distractions, friends who got caught up in bad choices, and the constant pressure to be something he wasn't. At school, things weren't much better. Malik was always a little different. The other kids teased him for being too smart, calling him the nerd or worse. He'd long ago given up on trying to make friends with the people who didn't understand him. Instead, he threw himself into his studies, finding solace in equations and books, which gave him something to hold on to when everything else around him felt chaotic. But it wasn't just his peers who treated him differently, it was the teachers, too. Some saw his potential and tried to nurture it, but others, like Mr. Thompson, seemed determined to break him down. Malik wasn't naive. He knew what people thought when they saw him, a kid from the wrong side of town, troublemaker, who probably wasn't going to amount to much. His grades didn't help dispel that stereotype either. Sure, he was smart, but he wasn't the best at fitting into the mold the school system expected of him. He didn't have the luxury of neatness or the patience to memorize things by rote. He was more of a thinker, someone who questioned everything, which didn't always go over well with the teachers who valued conformity over creativity. One teacher, in particular, had become a thorn in Malik's side, Mr. Thompson. The man had a way of singling Malik out, making him feel like an outsider in his own classroom. Malik could see the teacher's disdain whenever he raised his hand, or when he tried to offer a different way of thinking. Mr. Thompson didn't appreciate students who challenged his authority or, worse yet, made him look bad. That was exactly what had happened the other day. Malik had solved the impossible math problem in front of the class, but rather than giving him credit, Mr. Thompson had acted like it was a fluke. It wasn't about the math, it was about the fact that Malik, with his background and his intellect, had the audacity to challenge Mr. Thompson's authority. And that, Malik knew, was something that teachers like Mr. Thompson couldn't tolerate. But this wasn't just about the teacher. This was about something much deeper. Malik had always felt like the world was set up against him, like there was no place for someone like him to truly succeed. He had to fight for every bit of respect he earned, whether it was at school, with his peers, or even at home, where his mom often reminded him how important it was to be smart and strong in a world that didn't value people like them. Still, Malik's mind was a place of refuge, even if his environment wasn't. When he wasn't at school or hanging out with Jamal, he spent hours studying math, science, and history. The pages of his textbooks became his escape. It wasn't always easy, especially when he could hear the sounds of the neighborhood outside his window, or when his friends tried to lure him away from his homework with offers of games or hangouts. But Malik always returned to his books. They gave him hope, even when his real world felt like it was closing in on him. Jamal, his best friend since childhood, was the only person who truly understood him. Jamal wasn't interested in school the way Malik was, but he always had Malik's back. The two of them had been through a lot together, facing challenges, overcoming obstacles, and learning what it meant to stay loyal to each other. Jamal might not have understood the complexities of math or the deep dive Malik took into solving problems, but he respected Malik's drive. And that made all the difference. "Yo, Malik," Jamal said one afternoon as they sat on the stoop outside Malik's house, the sun setting in the distance. "You really nailed that problem in class today. You showed Mr. Thompson. I can't believe he was still trying to front like you didn't do it." Malik leaned back against the brick wall, rubbing his forehead. "It doesn't matter. He'll never give me credit. I know what he thinks of me. It's just frustrating." "I get it, man," Jamal said, his voice serious. "But you know, that's what makes it so sweet. He didn't expect you to do it. Nobody did. But you did. You showed them all. You've got something, Malik. Don't forget that." Malik smiled, but it was a tight, almost forced smile. The weight of Jamal's words lingered in the air, and for a brief moment, Malik allowed himself to feel a flicker of something that resembled hope. Maybe Jamal was right. Maybe he did have something others didn't see. But how long would it take for someone to notice? How many times would he have to prove himself before people finally saw the person he really was? As the evening shadows stretched long across the street, Malik's mind wandered back to that classroom. He had solved the problem. That was something. But it wasn't just about math, it was about standing up to the expectations, the biases, and the limitations others placed on him. It was about showing the world that he was more than just a kid from the wrong side of town. Malik had always known that if he wanted something different, something better, he'd have to fight for it. And today, he'd taken the first step. But there was a long way to go before anyone, least of all Mr. Thompson, would truly understand who Malik Johnson was. And he wasn't about to stop now. The days following the math problem were strangely quiet. Malik expected some kind of backlash, maybe more teasing from his classmates or even a few more jabs from Mr. Thompson, but nothing happened. The classroom had resumed its usual rhythm, and Mr. Thompson didn't acknowledge Malik's victory over the impossible math problem. He acted as if it had never happened. But Malik wasn't fooled. He knew the tension was building. He could feel it in the way Mr. Thompson's eyes followed him, in the way the teacher's tone carried a little more weight than before, as if daring Malik to challenge him again. But Malik wasn't looking for a fight. He didn't want to be the class clown or the one who always had to prove something. He just wanted to get through high school without drawing too much attention to himself. However, deep down, Malik knew the quiet before the storm never lasted long. It started on a Tuesday afternoon, when Mr. Thompson called on Malik again. He was, as usual, sitting in the back row, trying to stay out of the spotlight. But Mr. Thompson had other plans. "Malik," the teacher said, his voice laced with a sharp edge, "I'd like you to come up and solve this one for us. You were so quick to solve the last problem, let's see if you can handle this one." The class fell silent. All eyes turned to Malik, waiting for him to stand up. He felt a lump form in his throat, but he stood anyway, walking to the front of the room, trying not to let his nerves show. He couldn't let Mr. Thompson get the best of him, not again. He had already proved himself once, now was the time to show that it wasn't just a fluke. As he approached the chalkboard, Malik saw the new problem Mr. Thompson had written. It was even more complicated than the last one. His heart sank. This time, the problem wasn't just about numbers, it was a multi-step, multi-concept challenge, one that involved concepts Malik had only scratched the surface of. It felt like an impossible task. "Go ahead," Mr. Thompson said, his voice oozing condescension. "Show us how it's done." Malik didn't want to back down. He picked up the chalk and looked at the problem for a moment, trying to break it down in his mind. His thoughts raced, and for a moment, the weight of his classmates' stares made him feel small. He had to do this, though. He had to prove he wasn't just some lucky kid who'd gotten by on a single chance. But as he started writing, something happened. The chalk didn't move the way it should have. The symbols on the board swirled together in a blur, and he felt the pressure mounting, heavier with every passing second. The more he tried to focus, the more everything seemed to slip away from him. The problem that had once seemed solvable now felt like a mountain, and Malik's confidence began to crack. Mr. Thompson's voice cut through the silence once more, sharper this time. "What's the matter, Malik?" "Stuck." His words were like knives, and Malik could feel the heat rise in his chest. He didn't want to be stuck. He didn't want to fail. But the problem seemed impossible now, just like everything else in his life. The pressure was building, and with every tick of the clock, it became harder to focus. "Maybe math isn't really your thing after all," Mr. Thompson added, a sneer tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Or maybe you're just not as smart as you thought you were." The room fell silent. Malik's stomach churned, and his hand shook slightly as he tried to continue. He didn't want to let Mr. Thompson see how much his words were affecting him. He didn't want to show weakness. But he could feel the cracks forming inside. Malik stepped back from the board for a moment, trying to gather himself. His mind was clouded with doubt, and the weight of his teacher's harsh words felt unbearable. The classroom seemed to close in on him. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. It was like everything that had happened to him, every failed test, every insult, every time he had been told he wasn't enough, was crashing down on him all at once. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw Jamal. Jamal wasn't in the front row, where everyone else could see him, but he was still watching Malik from a few rows back. He gave Malik a slight nod, his expression calm but knowing. Jamal had always been there for him, even when the world seemed like it was falling apart. And in that moment, Malik knew he wasn't alone. Taking a deep breath, Malik stepped back up to the board. The weight of his doubts didn't disappear, but he pushed them down. He wasn't about to let Mr. Thompson, or anyone, define him. He had something inside of him that no one could take away. With renewed determination, Malik focused on the problem again. The numbers and symbols still seemed impossible, but this time, Malik approached it differently. He broke it down, step by step, letting go of the pressure. As he began to solve the equation, something inside him shifted. He wasn't trying to prove anything to Mr. Thompson or the class. He was doing it for himself. Minutes later, Malik stood back and looked at the solution. It wasn't perfect, but it was right. For the first time, he wasn't worried about what anyone else thought. He had solved the problem, and that was all that mattered. Mr. Thompson stood silent for a moment, his eyes narrowing. He had expected Malik to fail. But Malik hadn't. Malik had proven him wrong. "Well, I suppose you got it," Mr. Thompson muttered, almost begrudgingly, before turning to the rest of the class. "But let's see if you can do the next one." Malik didn't even acknowledge the teacher's comment. He walked back to his seat, his heart pounding but his mind clearer than it had been all day. This wasn't just about math anymore. This was about more than just solving problems on a board. It was about proving to himself that he could overcome anything that life, or Mr. Thompson, threw at him. The bell rang, signaling the end of the period. As the students packed up their things, Jamal caught Malik's eye. He gave him a thumbs up, a silent acknowledgement of what Malik had just achieved. But Malik's mind wasn't on Jamal or the teacher anymore. He was already thinking ahead. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. It wasn't until the following week that things truly began to shift for Malik. The tension between him and Mr. Thompson had been building since that fateful day in class, but it wasn't just confined to their interactions in the classroom. The energy had spread throughout the entire school. Malik couldn't walk through the halls without hearing whispers or feeling eyes on him. The class had clearly noticed the tension, and for some, it was an opportunity to push Malik even further. One Monday morning, as Malik entered the school, he immediately felt something different in the air. The students walking past him had an odd look in their eyes, part curiosity, part challenge. It was almost as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. That afternoon, during math class, Malik would find out just what was in store for him. Mr. Thompson called on him again. "Malik, I'm assigning you the challenge problem today. You've impressed everyone with your brilliance before, now let's see if you can handle this one," Mr. Thompson announced, his voice cold and calculating. A murmur rippled through the class. Malik's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just any problem. This was different. It wasn't an ordinary equation or a standard word problem, it was a riddle that Mr. Thompson had concocted, a multi-layered, deeply complex problem that had baffled even the best students. Malik had no choice but to stand up and face it. His stomach churned as he walked to the front of the class. This felt like a test, more than just a math problem. It was a challenge to his very existence. Everyone was watching, waiting for him to fail. Everyone, except for Jamal, who gave him a reassuring nod from his seat in the back. The chalkboard felt cold beneath Malik's fingertips as he picked up a piece of chalk. He stared at the problem, trying to make sense of the numbers and variables. At first, it felt like a blur, his mind raced with doubt. What if he couldn't do it? What if this time, he truly wasn't enough? But then, he took a breath and centered himself. He had come this far. He couldn't stop now. The classroom had gone completely silent, as if time itself had frozen. The only sounds were the soft scrape of the chalk against the board and the quickening rhythm of Malik's heart. As he worked through the steps, piece by piece, the initial fog of uncertainty began to clear. His mind, though nervous, clicked into a rhythm. The numbers made sense. The problem wasn't impossible, not if he approached it the right way. The chalk flew across the board as Malik worked, each line of the solution like a battle he was winning. He could feel the stares, the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on him. But Malik knew something now. He knew that he wasn't doing this for anyone but himself. He wasn't just proving something to Mr. Thompson or the class. He was showing himself that he was capable of something great. Minutes passed, but Malik didn't feel the passage of time. He was lost in the problem, in the beauty of the solution unfolding in front of him. The final answer was clear, and as he wrote the last line on the board, he stood back and looked at it. For a brief moment, there was nothing but silence. Mr. Thompson stared at the board, his mouth slightly agape, as if the answer didn't quite make sense to him. The class seemed unsure whether to applaud or remain silent. It was a weird tension, some were in disbelief, others in awe. Malik stood there, holding his breath, waiting for the moment when he would finally be acknowledged. But that moment never came. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, standing rigid at the front of the room. "Well, I suppose that's the answer, Malik. But I'm not sure if it's the right one." The way Mr. Thompson said it made it clear that he didn't want to give Malik any credit. His words were laced with doubt and condescension, as if trying to undermine Malik's achievement. It was more than just about the math problem now, it was a battle of wills, a test of resilience. The class seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Malik to react. He could feel the weight of their eyes, some judging him, some waiting for him to fight back. But Malik didn't give in. He wasn't going to let Mr. Thompson break him. He wasn't going to give the teacher the satisfaction of seeing him stumble. Instead, Malik looked Mr. Thompson in the eye, standing tall. "I solved it, Mr. Thompson. You can either accept that or not." The room went dead quiet. No one spoke. No one moved. It felt like the entire school was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Malik's heart raced, but he stood his ground. He had done what he had set out to do. Whether Mr. Thompson acknowledged it or not, Malik had won this round. Mr. Thompson's lips tightened, but he didn't respond. He just motioned for the class to move on. But Malik knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. That night, as Malik lay in bed, he couldn't stop replaying the events of the day. Part of him was still stunned by the teacher's refusal to acknowledge his success. But another part of him, the part that Jamal had always encouraged, was proud. Malik had stood up for himself. He had proven that he was capable of so much more than people gave him credit for. As he drifted off to sleep, Malik thought about the future. This journey wasn't just about math or school, it was about proving his worth, proving that he belonged, no matter what anyone thought of him. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but Malik had something inside of him that no one could take away. He was more than just a kid from the wrong side of town. He was someone who could change the world. And nothing, was going to stop him now. The days that followed the confrontation with Mr. Thompson were tense, to say the least. Malik's confidence had been bolstered by his silent victory, but he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to escalate. He could feel it in the air, like a storm gathering on the horizon, waiting to break. It wasn't just about math anymore. Malik had become a symbol of defiance, not just for his classmates, but for himself. He had taken a stand, and in doing so, he had found a strength inside that he hadn't known he possessed. But as the days passed, he realized that strength came at a cost. Everywhere he went, people were talking about him. Some praised him for standing up to Mr. Thompson, others resented him for it. The whispers and stares were constant. His friends, Jamal and the others, stood by him, but even they couldn't shield him from the ripple effects of that one moment in class. One afternoon, as Malik walked through the crowded hallway, he overheard a conversation between two students near his locker. "Did you see Malik's math problem?" "That was crazy," one of them said, clearly impressed. "He solved it like it was nothing." But the other student shook their head. "Yeah, but don't you think Mr. Thompson was right to call him out? I mean, no one's that perfect. He probably just got lucky." The words hit Malik like a punch to the gut. Lucky. That's what people thought of him, that he was some fluke, a lucky kid who happened to solve a hard problem. It wasn't about his intelligence or his effort, it was just luck. He wanted to confront them, to tell them that they didn't understand, that he had earned that moment. But instead, he just kept walking, the weight of their words sinking deeper into his chest. By the time he reached his next class, the tension was unbearable. The look on Jamal's face told him everything. It wasn't just about Mr. Thompson anymore. It was about the whole school. Malik had become a target, a symbol of something that no one fully understood, and maybe, no one truly cared to understand. It was in that moment, as Malik sat down in his seat and looked around at the faces of his classmates, that he realized just how alone he felt. No one truly saw him for who he was, not the quiet kid in the back of the class, but the person with a mind that was capable of so much more than they gave him credit for. But then, the bell rang. Class started. And despite the emotional turmoil, Malik forced himself to focus. For the next few days, things didn't improve. The stares, the whispers, they only grew louder. Malik tried to keep his head down and focus on his work, but it was hard to concentrate when every class felt like a battlefield. Then, one Friday afternoon, it all came to a head. It was nearing the end of the school day when Mr. Thompson assigned another impossible problem to the class. Malik felt a pang of anxiety in his chest. He had just begun to find a rhythm again in class, trying to ignore the tension, but here it was again, the challenge, the test. Malik knew what was coming. He knew that this time, it wouldn't just be about math. It was going to be about everything he had fought for. Malik, Mr. Thompson said, almost casually, as though he had been waiting for this moment all along, solve this one for us, would you? Malik didn't move right away. He couldn't. His hands were shaking, his stomach in knots. This wasn't just about numbers. It was about dignity. His dignity. The class was watching, waiting to see if he could pull it off again. He could feel the weight of their expectations, but more than that, he could feel the weight of their judgment. And worst of all, he could feel Mr. Thompson's smugness as he silently dared Malik to fail. The room fell silent. All eyes were on him. Malik stood up slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. His hands gripped the edge of the desk, but he didn't pick up the chalk. He couldn't. He knew that he could solve the problem. He was smart enough. But in that moment, standing at the front of the room, he realized something. It wasn't just about being smart anymore. It wasn't just about winning or proving something to the class, to Mr. Thompson, or to anyone. It was about how far he was willing to push himself and how much he was willing to endure in the face of pressure. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. But that realization hit hard. He wasn't sure he was ready to let go of the fight. He had spent so long fighting to be seen, fighting to be recognized for who he truly was. Could he just walk away from it all? Could he let it go? The moment dragged on. The tension was unbearable. And then, Malik spoke. "I don't need to solve this problem, Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, though it trembled with emotion. "Not for you, not for anyone." The class was stunned into silence. Jamal, sitting in the back, shot Malik a look of surprise and admiration. Malik stood tall, shoulders squared, looking directly at Mr. Thompson. "For what it's worth," Malik continued, his voice quiet but firm, "I'm more than just a problem to solve. And I'm done proving myself to anyone." There was no applause, no cheers. But the message was clear. Malik had taken control of his own narrative. He wasn't going to let anyone define him anymore. He wasn't going to let the weight of other people's expectations break him. Mr. Thompson's face flushed with anger, but he didn't say anything. He just turned away and continued the lesson as if nothing had happened. But Malik wasn't looking at him anymore. His eyes were fixed on the future, on a path that was his to choose. That night, Malik lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over him. The pressure, the weight of everyone's opinions, it was still there, but it no longer held the power over him that it once did. He had made a choice. And somehow, that felt like the first step toward freedom. The next few days at school felt different, almost surreal. The air around Malik had shifted. After his bold refusal to solve the impossible problem in Mr. Thompson's class, he had expected backlash, some kind of confrontation. But strangely, nothing happened. No one really approached him with criticism or praise. It was as though the whole school had hit a pause button, waiting to see what would come next. Malik was starting to wonder if he had done the right thing. Did he make a mistake? Maybe he should have just solved the problem like everyone expected. But a voice inside him, one that had grown stronger over the past few weeks, told him that he had done the right thing. He didn't need to prove himself anymore. But despite his internal conviction, it was hard to ignore the stares. He could feel the weight of them, even when no one was saying anything aloud. His classmates, his teachers, especially Mr. Thompson, seemed to be observing him, waiting for him to slip up, waiting for him to break. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Jamal finally pulled Malik aside in the hallway, away from the prying eyes of the other students. "Yo, Malik," Jamal said, his voice low, "you good?" Malik hesitated for a second, his eyes scanning the hallway before meeting his friend's gaze. "Yeah, man. I'm good." But Jamal didn't buy it. He could see through the facade. "Come on, man. I know you're not okay. That whole thing with Mr. Thompson, that was crazy. You could have solved it if you wanted to." Malik shrugged, trying to act like it wasn't bothering him. "I didn't want to. I had to make a point. You saw the way he looked at me. Like I wasn't even human. Like I was just some experiment for him to mess with." Jamal nodded slowly. "Yeah, I get that. But listen, Malik, you can't let this eat at you. You've got something special. You know it, I know it. The whole school knows it." Malik sighed. "But that's the problem, Jamal. Everyone thinks they know me. They think they know what I can do, but they don't. They only see what they want to see. And if I don't keep proving myself, they'll just keep thinking I'm nothing more than a math whiz." Jamal gave him a serious look. "Malik, man, don't let them tell you who you are. Only you get to do that. You're not just some whiz. You're more than that. You've got a whole future ahead of you. People are gonna see that, but you gotta let them see you for who you really are." Malik's mind raced as Jamal's words echoed in his head. He had always felt like he had to keep proving himself to the world, especially to the people who didn't believe in him. But now, there was a question forming in his mind: what if he didn't have to prove anything anymore? What if he could just be? As he walked to his next class, his thoughts remained a whirlwind. What Jamal had said struck a chord in him. He had always been defined by others, by his math skills, by the labels placed on him because of where he came from, by his race. But he was tired of being confined to those boxes. He was tired of letting other people decide who he was and what he was worth. Malik needed to take control of his own story. That afternoon, in his algebra class, Malik had another one of those moments. Mr. Thompson handed back their most recent test, and Malik's heart sank when he saw his score. It wasn't a bad grade, just a little lower than what he usually received. It was clear to him that Mr. Thompson had deliberately marked him down, trying to undermine his confidence. Malik had worked hard on that test, but it didn't matter. To Mr. Thompson, nothing was ever good enough. He had made that much painfully clear. The problem wasn't the grade, it was the principle. Malik could feel his chest tighten with frustration. He had been doing everything right, but it never seemed like it was enough for Mr. Thompson. It was like this endless cycle of trying and failing, always falling short in the eyes of the teacher who refused to see his potential. Malik took a deep breath. No more, he thought. I don't need his approval. He decided, then and there, that he wasn't going to let Mr. Thompson's judgment, or anyone else's for that matter, hold him back. It was time to redefine success on his own terms. As the bell rang and the class began to file out, Malik stayed behind, waiting for Mr. Thompson to finish speaking with another student. He wasn't sure exactly what he was going to say, but he knew he had to say something. When the classroom emptied, and the door shut behind the last student, Malik stood up and walked toward Mr. Thompson's desk. The teacher glanced up, surprised, but his face quickly shifted into the same condescending look Malik had become so familiar with. "Malik, is there something you need?" Mr. Thompson asked in a tone that felt more dismissive than anything else. Malik's voice was steady, but the words came out more forcefully than he expected. "I just want you to know that I'm not gonna let you define me anymore. I'm not gonna let you or anyone else tell me what I can or can't do. I'm more than this classroom. And I'm more than the grades you give me." Mr. Thompson opened his mouth to respond, but Malik held up a hand, stopping him. "I'm done with this game, sir," Malik said firmly. "And if you really think you know what I'm capable of, then you're wrong." For a second, Mr. Thompson looked stunned. But then his expression hardened, and he straightened his back. "You think you can just walk into my classroom and challenge me like that?" Malik didn't flinch. "Yeah, I do. Because I'm not asking for your approval anymore." Without waiting for a response, Malik turned and walked out of the classroom, the sound of his shoes echoing in the empty hallways. He didn't look back. He wasn't going to let Mr. Thompson's dismissal hold him down. Malik had finally realized something important: he didn't need anyone's validation to succeed. His potential wasn't tied to what others thought of him, but to what he believed about himself. That night, as Malik lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace wash over him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had taken control of his own destiny. The future was no longer just a series of challenges and obstacles, it was an opportunity for him to redefine what it meant to succeed. Malik wasn't just a kid in a math class anymore. He was a young man on a journey to discover who he truly was, and he was finally ready to embrace the path ahead. As the week wore on, Malik's life seemed to take on a different rhythm. The tension of the past few days, the emotional whirlwind, had settled into something he could only describe as calm determination. He wasn't sure if it was because he had finally chosen to stop caring what others thought or if it was just the natural result of standing up for himself, but Malik felt a new sense of clarity. He had learned something valuable: his value didn't depend on anyone else's opinions. But the calm didn't last long. The moment Malik stepped into his second period class on Wednesday, he felt the familiar eyes on him again. His classmates watched him, some curious, others judgmental, and a few, like Jamal, offering him encouraging smiles. It was almost like a waiting game, everyone waiting to see how he would react next. It was then that Malik noticed someone who hadn't been part of the equation before: Mrs. Harrison. She was an English teacher at the school, known for being quiet, almost aloof. She didn't have a lot of interaction with Malik's grade, but there she was, sitting at the back of the room during his algebra class, writing something in her notebook. The class was starting, and Malik found a seat at the back, trying to keep a low profile. He wasn't sure if it was his presence or something else, but there was a subtle shift in the energy in the room. When Mrs. Harrison caught his eye, she gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough to send a curious spark through Malik. The lesson began, and for the next 20 minutes, Malik buried himself in his work. But all the while, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was unfolding. As Mr. Thompson launched into another one of his long-winded explanations, Malik looked up to find Mrs. Harrison watching him intently, her gaze more focused than anyone else's in the room. After class ended, Malik stood up and grabbed his books. As he made his way to the door, he noticed Mrs. Harrison was lingering behind, talking to Mr. Thompson in low voices. Just before he walked out, he heard her say something that stopped him dead in his tracks. "He's more than you think." Malik's heart raced, his mind spinning with questions. Was she talking about him? More than what? More than just the kid who could solve math problems. More than just someone who got under Mr. Thompson's skin. Before he could make sense of it, Mrs. Harrison turned around, caught his eye again, and waved him over. "Malik, can I have a word?" Her voice was calm, even reassuring. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded, stepping over to where she was standing. Mr. Thompson was gone, leaving them alone in the now empty classroom. "I wasn't sure how to approach you," she began, looking directly at him with a kind of warmth that caught him off guard. "But after everything that's been going on, I wanted to let you know that I see you." Malik frowned slightly, unsure of what she meant. "I see you," she repeated. "I see what you're capable of. And I know Mr. Thompson, well, he has his own way of doing things. But you're not just a problem to be solved. You're more than that." For a moment, Malik stood in stunned silence. He had never expected anyone to speak to him like this, especially not a teacher. It was like Mrs. Harrison was the first person to truly understand what he'd been feeling all along. "You're the kind of student who doesn't just follow the rules," she continued, "and that's a good thing. It's what makes you stand out. But be careful, Malik. Sometimes people will try to box you in, label you, and think they have you all figured out. Don't let that happen. Stay true to yourself." The weight of her words settled over Malik, and for the first time in a while, he felt a sense of validation he hadn't realized he was craving. It wasn't just Jamal who believed in him. It was Mrs. Harrison too. "Thank you," Malik said quietly, unsure of what else to say. He had expected a lecture, maybe even a reprimand, but instead, he had been given something far more valuable, someone who understood. She smiled warmly at him. "You don't have to thank me. Just remember this, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. You already have everything you need inside you." With that, she turned to gather her things, and Malik, still in a daze, left the room. As he walked down the hallway, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Mrs. Harrison's words echoed in his mind, "Stay true to yourself." Malik wasn't entirely sure what that meant yet, but it felt like the beginning of something important. Maybe it wasn't just about the fight with Mr. Thompson or about his grades. Maybe it was about finding a new sense of self, a version of him that didn't rely on approval from others. Maybe, just maybe, he could be the kind of person who defined his own path, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. Later that afternoon, Jamal found Malik sitting under a tree outside the school, deep in thought. He plopped down beside his friend, his usual wide grin spreading across his face. "So, what's up with you?" Jamal asked, nudging Malik's shoulder. "You look like you just had a light bulb moment or something." Malik chuckled softly. "I think I did," he replied. "Mrs. Harrison, she told me I don't have to prove myself to anyone. That I'm already enough." Jamal raised an eyebrow. "Dang, she said that?" "Yeah. And I think she's right." For the first time in a long time, Malik felt lighter. He wasn't carrying the weight of everyone else's expectations anymore. He could breathe. "I guess I just needed to hear it from someone," Malik said, looking at his friend. "I don't have to be perfect, Jamal. I'm not here to impress anyone. I'm here to figure things out for myself." Jamal slapped him on the back. "That's what I've been trying to tell you all along, bro. You've got this." As Malik looked out at the horizon, he realized that maybe this was the turning point he had been waiting for. Maybe he didn't need to solve every problem thrown his way. Maybe he didn't need to be the perfect student, the perfect son, the perfect anything. He just needed to be Malik. And that was more than enough. Malik's newfound sense of self was a powerful shift in his life. But as any good story goes, just as things seemed to be turning around, new challenges inevitably appeared. The day after his conversation with Mrs. Harrison, Malik noticed something different in the hallways at school. It wasn't the usual stares from students, nor the whispers behind his back, it was the shift in how his classmates treated him. Some of them seemed to be in awe of his refusal to solve Mr. Thompson's impossible problem, but others were not so supportive. At lunch, Malik sat down with Jamal, but before he could even take a bite of his sandwich, someone from another table spoke up. "Hey, Malik. Heard you think you're too good for math now," a voice called out mockingly. It was Sarah, a girl from his class who had always been on the sidelines, watching the drama but never getting involved. She'd always been friendly to Malik, but something about the way she said that made him feel uneasy. "Yeah, Malik. You going all rebel on us?" one of her friends added, snickering. "You're gonna get yourself in trouble." Malik's stomach tightened. He hadn't expected this. He had thought that standing up for himself would somehow change things for the better, but now it felt like his decision was drawing more negative attention. Jamal, sensing the tension, glared at the group. "Yo, shut up. Malik's just trying to do his thing. You don't know what he's been through." Sarah rolled her eyes. "Oh please, Jamal. We all know Malik's got the smarts. But when you refuse to help the teacher out, what's that supposed to prove?" Malik felt a wave of frustration rise within him. Why couldn't people just leave him alone? He had made his point to Mr. Thompson, but now it seemed like his own peers were trying to push him into a box of their own. He wasn't some troublemaker. He wasn't trying to be the center of attention. He was just trying to figure things out for himself. "Don't let it bother you," Jamal said, breaking Malik from his thoughts. "People will always talk. You know who you are." Malik nodded but still felt the sting of the comment. He had been thinking about what Mrs. Harrison said, how he didn't need to prove himself to anyone, but it wasn't always easy. It was one thing to hear someone tell you that you're enough. It was another to live it. Later that day, after school let out, Malik found himself standing at his locker, gathering his things when someone suddenly called his name. "Malik." It was Mr. Thompson's voice. Malik froze. He hadn't expected to see him after the incident in class a few days ago. He turned slowly, his heartbeat picking up. Mr. Thompson stood in the doorway of the hallway, his face rigid but not unfriendly. "I need to speak with you for a moment." Malik didn't know what to expect. Was Mr. Thompson going to make some grand show of punishing him? Was he going to give him a lecture about respect or discipline? Malik took a deep breath, bracing himself for whatever was to come. "Come on," Mr. Thompson said, motioning for Malik to follow him to the side of the building. Once they were out of earshot from the main crowd, Mr. Thompson looked at him with an expression that was far less hostile than Malik had anticipated. "I wanted to apologize," Mr. Thompson said, his voice quieter than usual. "For the way I handled the problem in class." Malik's eyebrows shot up. Apologize? Was this really happening? "I pushed you too hard," Mr. Thompson continued. "I shouldn't have asked you to solve that problem the way I did. I wasn't being fair to you. I've been frustrated with my own teaching, and I took that out on you. I'm sorry." Malik was momentarily stunned. The apology wasn't what he had expected at all. He thought for sure that Mr. Thompson was going to double down, maybe even try to humiliate him in front of the class. But instead, Mr. Thompson's tone was almost regretful. "Thank you," Malik said cautiously. He wasn't sure if this apology was a genuine change of heart or just an attempt to save face, but either way, it was a rare moment of vulnerability from the teacher. Mr. Thompson nodded, looking at Malik with something like respect in his eyes. "Just keep doing what you're doing. Don't let anyone tell you who you should be." "I see that now." Malik stood there, surprised, unsure of how to respond. He had expected the worst, and yet, here was Mr. Thompson, offering a rare acknowledgement. Maybe, just maybe, things were shifting in ways Malik hadn't expected. "Thanks," Malik said again, still processing the unexpected turn in their conversation. "I'll try." With that, Mr. Thompson walked away, leaving Malik standing there with a strange sense of relief. But when Malik got home that evening, the relief he had felt earlier started to fade. The weight of his mother's words that morning lingered in his mind. She had always pushed him to be better, but tonight, something was different. His mom wasn't just pushing him academically, she was pushing him emotionally, too. "Malik," she said as they sat down for dinner, "I've been hearing some things at work. People are talking about you." Malik stiffened. He knew what she was talking about. The whole refusal to solve the problem incident was making its rounds at school. And now, it seemed to be spilling over into the adult world too. "Mom, I don't care about what people are saying," Malik said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "I'm just trying to focus on what's important." But his mom wasn't having it. "You don't get it, Malik. You can't just throw away the opportunities you've been given. This is your future we're talking about. I don't want you to mess it up by making things harder for yourself." Malik felt the familiar pressure building in his chest. His mom always had the best intentions, but sometimes it felt like she was suffocating him. There was always this sense that no matter what he did, it wasn't good enough. He wasn't perfect enough. "I'm not throwing away anything, Mom," Malik said quietly. "I'm just trying to be myself." His mom looked at him, her expression softening. "I get it, Malik. I do. But just be careful. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, but you can't let people think you don't care. You're better than that." Malik didn't know how to respond. Part of him understood what his mom was saying, but another part of him knew that he couldn't live his life just to please everyone else. There had to be a balance between proving himself and staying true to who he was. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Malik realized something: the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. There would always be people, his peers, his teachers, even his own family, who tried to box him in, who tried to tell him who he should be. But Malik knew one thing for sure now: he was done trying to fit into someone else's mold. He was going to carve out his own path, even if it meant facing more challenges along the way. Malik had always considered himself a quiet, introspective person. He was used to watching from the sidelines, observing his peers and carefully calculating his next move. But the events of the past few weeks had forced him out of his shell. He was no longer content to stay in the background, he had a voice now, and he was starting to use it. But with every choice he made, it felt like the stakes were rising, and the pressure to conform to the expectations of others was intensifying. It all came to a head one Friday afternoon, just a few days after his conversation with his mom. Malik had been walking to his next class when he overheard a conversation in the hallway that made his stomach turn. "Malik's really been acting out lately," one of the girls in his grade was saying. "He's not even trying to hide it. It's like he's doing it on purpose just to make everyone notice him." "Yeah, he's probably just trying to be all rebellious or something," another voice chimed in. Malik's heart sank. He stopped walking, feeling the weight of the words sinking in. It wasn't that he hadn't expected some kind of backlash after his decision to stand up to Mr. Thompson, but hearing it so plainly from his peers was like a punch to the gut. He had thought that after everything, after standing his ground, people might start to see him differently, more respectably. But now, it felt like he was being labeled as the troublemaker, the kid who couldn't follow the rules. His chest tightened with frustration, and for a moment, he didn't know how to react. Should he confront them? Should he just let it go? But as he stood there, staring at the floor, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Malik, hey." Jamal's cheerful tone was like a breath of fresh air after the suffocating conversation he had just overheard. Malik turned to see his friend jogging toward him, his backpack bouncing with each step. "What's up, bro?" Jamal asked, giving him a small smile. "You look like you just saw a ghost." I heard something," Malik said, his voice low. "People are talking about me. They think I'm just trying to make a scene. That I'm doing this on purpose." Jamal raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled. "What? Are you serious?" "Yeah, I'm serious," Malik muttered. "They think I'm just trying to get attention or something. Like, I'm some kind of rebel." Jamal paused for a moment, his expression softening. Man, that sucks. But listen, who cares what they think? You know who you are, right? And you know what you're doing. That's all that matters. Malik didn't respond at first. Jamal's words were comforting, but they didn't erase the sting of the situation. The truth was, he didn't know how to handle it. The pressure to be someone he wasn't was starting to wear him down. The bell rang, signaling the start of the next class, and they both headed inside. But for the rest of the day, Malik's mind was elsewhere. Every glance from his classmates, every quiet whisper behind his back, felt like a weight he couldn't shake off. It was like his entire identity was being questioned, and he didn't know how to fight it. That night, Malik sat at his desk, staring at his textbooks, but he couldn't focus. The words in front of him blurred together as he replayed the events of the day over and over in his mind. He couldn't help but feel like everything was slipping through his fingers. His phone buzzed, breaking his train of thought. He glanced at the screen to see a text from Jamal. "Jamal, you good, man?" Malik hesitated for a moment before typing back. "Malik, I don't know, Jamal. I'm trying to do my thing, but it feels like people are turning on me. I'm not sure what to do anymore." The reply came almost instantly. "Jamal, bro, you gotta stay strong. People always talk. Don't let it get to you. You're better than that. You're smarter than that. Keep doing your thing." Malik stared at the message for a moment. Jamal's words were encouraging, but they didn't feel like enough. The truth was, Malik was exhausted. He wasn't just tired of fighting against Mr. Thompson's unreasonable expectations or his mom's pressure, he was tired of constantly trying to prove himself to everyone around him. Why did this have to be so hard? He put the phone down and sighed. The weight of it all was crushing. His entire life had been shaped by the expectations of others. Whether it was his mom telling him to be the best, Mr. Thompson pushing him to outperform everyone else in class, or his classmates thinking he was just another kid trying to get attention, Malik was starting to feel like he was suffocating. That's when the thought hit him, what if he wasn't meant to prove anything to anyone? What if, for once, he could just let go of the pressure and be who he was, without the need for approval or validation from anyone else? It was a scary thought. For as long as he could remember, he had always measured his worth by what others thought of him. But now, it was clear to him, living for the approval of others would only make him miserable. He couldn't keep fighting against every force in his life just to make people happy. He had to stop trying to be someone else's idea of who he should be. Malik leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in a long while, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't an easy realization, and it certainly wasn't a quick fix. But it was a step in the right direction. The next day at school, Malik walked through the hallways with a new sense of resolve. He wasn't going to let the whispers or the judgments affect him. He wasn't going to be anyone's puppet. He was going to take control of his own story. As he approached his locker, he saw Mr. Thompson standing nearby, talking to another teacher. This time, though, Malik didn't hesitate. He walked past Mr. Thompson with his head held high, a quiet confidence in his step. For the first time in a long time, Malik didn't care about what anyone thought. He was done trying to fit into someone else's expectations. From now on, he was going to define his own path. It wasn't going to be easy. But Malik was done running from himself. He was ready to face whatever came next, on his terms. The next few days at school felt different. The usual tension that Malik had been carrying around seemed to lift slightly, replaced by something new, curiosity. It was subtle at first, small shifts in the way his peers looked at him, whispers that didn't seem as hostile, but more like interest. It had only been a few weeks since he'd stood up to Mr. Thompson, and already, people seemed to be starting to notice him in a different light. The thought made Malik uneasy. He wasn't sure whether he wanted to be the center of attention. But the way people looked at him now wasn't filled with judgment or scorn, it was, something else. Intrigue. Respect? Maybe. That Friday afternoon, Malik found himself walking home alone, as usual, lost in thought. He passed by the old community center, where a group of kids from his class were hanging out. Normally, he'd avoid them, but today, something urged him to stop. He saw Jamal sitting on the steps, chatting with some of their classmates. When he noticed Malik approaching, he waved him over. "Yo, Malik. Come hang with us for a bit." Malik hesitated, but then he decided to join them. As he walked over, he caught snippets of the conversation, nothing too exciting, just the usual talk about homework and weekend plans. But then someone spoke up, someone Malik didn't expect. "Hey Malik," Sarah, the girl who had mocked him earlier in the week, called out. She was sitting at the edge of the group, looking at him with a new kind of curiosity in her eyes. "Yeah." Malik responded, feeling a little uneasy. It was strange to see her talking to him like this after the way they had clashed earlier. "I just wanted to say," Sarah said, her voice almost shy, "I didn't mean what I said the other day. About you not caring about math. I get it now. You don't have to solve every problem the way people expect you to." Malik blinked, caught off guard by her apology. Thanks," he said, not sure how to respond. "It's all right." The group around him seemed to quiet down, as if waiting for something more to happen. Malik's stomach twisted, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he shifted the conversation. "What's up with everyone today? You all look like you're plotting something." Jamal laughed, leaning back on the steps. "Nothing too crazy, man. Just talking about the upcoming science fair. You thinking of entering this year?" Malik raised an eyebrow. Science fair. It had never been his thing before, but now he was feeling a little more confident. Maybe it wouldn't be such a bad idea to try. "I don't know," Malik said slowly, his mind already starting to wander to ideas. "What kind of project are you guys doing?" Jamal shrugged. "Nothing too special, probably just building a volcano or something basic like that." "What about you, Malik? You've always been pretty good at problem solving. You could do something really cool." Malik smiled faintly. That was the first time anyone had said something like that to him. He had always been good with numbers and patterns, even though he'd never really been given the chance to show it. The idea of applying his skills to something creative for once excited him. "I'll think about it," Malik said, more to himself than anyone else. The following weekend, Malik couldn't stop thinking about the science fair. Something about the challenge of it felt different now that he had begun to embrace who he really was. What started as an overwhelming feeling of pressure now seemed like an opportunity. He wasn't just solving problems to please others anymore. He was solving problems for himself. He spent hours in his room brainstorming ideas. He thought about all the times he'd felt out of place, all the moments he'd been overlooked or dismissed. And then, he had an idea. A simple one, but powerful nonetheless. Monday morning, Malik walked into his math class with a renewed sense of purpose. He'd spent the weekend sketching out ideas for his project, and now he felt ready to take it to the next level. But before he could even sit down, Mr. Thompson caught his eye. "Malik," Mr. Thompson called, motioning for him to come over. Malik approached the teacher's desk, unsure of what to expect. Had Mr. Thompson reconsidered his earlier apology? Or was he going to go back on his word? "I've been thinking about your refusal to solve that problem in class," Mr. Thompson began, his voice serious. "And I wanted to tell you. I respect your decision. Not everyone would stand up the way you did. It's clear that you've got a lot of potential, Malik." Malik was stunned. He hadn't expected this kind of encouragement from Mr. Thompson. Was this teacher actually starting to see him for who he truly was, not just the kid who defied him in class? "Thanks, Mr. Thompson," Malik said, his voice soft but steady. He couldn't believe it. This felt like a real turning point. Just don't let it go to your head, all right? Mr. Thompson added with a smile, trying to lighten the mood. There's still plenty of work to do. But I think you're on the right track. Malik smiled back, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was finally being seen for who he truly was, not for the problems he caused or the person people wanted him to be, but for the potential he had within him. That afternoon, Malik sat in his room, sketching out the final details of his science fair project. It was simple, really. He was going to create a model that demonstrated the principles of pattern recognition in nature, something that had always fascinated him. He was going to showcase how seemingly random events, like the patterns in trees or the fractals in snowflakes, could be broken down and understood mathematically. The project wasn't flashy. It wasn't going to win any grand awards. But for Malik, it was everything. It was proof that he didn't have to be like everyone else. He didn't have to conform to the expectations placed on him. He could be his own kind of genius. As he finished sketching out the design, Malik sat back in his chair, feeling a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't about impressing his classmates or proving anything to Mr. Thompson anymore. This was for him. This was Malik finally finding his own voice. And it felt amazing. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Malik spent the next week refining his science fair project, perfecting the little details, adding new layers of complexity to the model he had created. He worked late into the night, determined to make it something he could be proud of. But it wasn't just about the project anymore. It was about something deeper, something he hadn't fully realized until now. He was no longer concerned with trying to fit into someone else's mold or meeting their expectations. Malik had spent so much of his life hiding his true abilities, second-guessing himself, and questioning whether he was good enough. But now, he felt different. He felt empowered. As he worked on his project, the pieces of his identity started to fall into place. Malik wasn't just a student who had struggled to meet societal expectations. He was someone with an incredible mind, a person with unique abilities that didn't need to be validated by others. He could think outside the box. He could break down problems and find solutions others overlooked. It wasn't about being the smartest. It was about being true to himself. It was on the second to last day before the science fair that Malik was suddenly reminded of something that had slipped from his mind in all the chaos of the last few weeks. He was on his way to class when he bumped into a familiar face, Amara, his best friend from the neighborhood. They hadn't spoken much recently, since Malik had been so consumed with his project, but he couldn't help but smile when he saw her. "Yo, Malik." Amara greeted him, grinning as she walked toward him. "What's up?" "Not much," Malik said, pushing his hands into his pockets. "Just working on this project for the science fair. It's been keeping me busy." "Science fair, huh?" she said, raising an eyebrow. "I thought you'd never do something like that." Malik shrugged. "Yeah, well, I'm kinda tired of sitting back and letting people tell me what I should and shouldn't do. I'm doing this for me." Amara paused, her expression softening. "I get that. You've always been smarter than people give you credit for. Don't let them hold you back, Malik. You've got something special." Her words were simple, but they stuck with him. For years, he had let others define him, first his teachers, then his mom, and even his classmates. But Amara was right. He was more than the labels people had placed on him. He was a thinker, a problem solver, someone who had the ability to change the world in ways others couldn't see. That afternoon, as he sat in his room, he thought back to the conversation he'd had with Jamal a few days ago about how he could use his skills for something bigger than just himself. The idea of proving himself to others didn't matter anymore, but the idea of using his abilities to make a real difference in the world did. The day of the science fair arrived quickly, and Malik couldn't help but feel a little nervous. As he walked into the gymnasium, where the event was being held, he was greeted by a sea of students bustling around, setting up their projects. Some of the displays were extravagant, complete with blinking lights and moving parts. Others were simpler, but no less impressive in their own way. Malik's table was at the back of the room, hidden between a project about artificial intelligence and one about renewable energy. His project didn't have flashing lights or dramatic sound effects. It was simple, a clean design with a small model showing how patterns in nature could be broken down mathematically. To Malik, it was perfect. He set up the project, arranging the pieces with care, and stood back to admire his work. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. This wasn't about impressing anyone or proving something to his classmates. It was about showing them, and, more importantly, himself, that he was capable of creating something meaningful. As the judging began, Malik stood by his table, quietly observing the other projects. He watched as students eagerly explained their ideas to the judges, feeling a sense of pride that, even though his project was smaller and more understated, it had substance. He was explaining something he truly understood, something that came naturally to him. For once, he wasn't trying to force himself into a mold that didn't fit. He was simply being Malik. Later in the afternoon, after all the students had presented their projects, the results were announced. Malik's heart pounded in his chest as he stood with his classmates, awaiting the names of the winners. And the winner of the science fair, for their exceptional work in demonstrating the intricacies of natural patterns, is Malik Carter. Malik's eyes widened in disbelief. The room erupted into applause, and for a split second, he couldn't comprehend what had just happened. He was the winner. He had actually won. He stepped forward, his heart racing as he shook hands with the judges and accepted his prize, a small trophy and a certificate. As he stood at the front of the room, holding the award, he realized that this wasn't just about the trophy. It wasn't about winning. It was about everything he had overcome to get here. The pressure, the expectations, the doubt, all of it had led him to this moment. But more than anything, this was his own victory. It was the moment when he finally understood that he didn't have to be anyone else. He didn't need anyone's approval. He was Malik, and that was enough. Later that night, as he sat in his room, reflecting on everything that had happened, Malik felt a sense of fulfillment that he had never experienced before. The applause at the science fair had faded, but the confidence he had gained remained. For the first time, he wasn't just looking ahead to the next challenge or the next thing that would prove his worth. He was finally, truly proud of himself. And that was a victory no trophy could ever replace. The days after the science fair were a blur. The congratulations poured in from teachers, classmates, and even some of the more unexpected people in Malik's life, like his mom, who had always seemed too busy or overwhelmed to take much notice of his achievements. Malik had found himself staring at the small trophy on his desk every now and then, not quite sure what to make of it. It wasn't about the recognition anymore, it was about something deeper. Something he couldn't quite put into words. Still, life at school continued as it always had. His classmates seemed more inclined to acknowledge him, but their interest felt like something different now, less judgment, more curiosity. Malik had become a subject of interest in the halls, not the outcast or the quiet kid in the back of the class anymore. It wasn't a transformation that happened overnight, but there was no denying it, people were beginning to see him in a new light. It was a Thursday afternoon when things took a turn, and the change was far from what Malik had expected. He had just entered the classroom for his last period of the day, a math class with Mr. Thompson. Normally, he would have walked in, settled into his seat, and gotten ready to tune out. But that day felt different. There was a palpable tension in the air as students filed in and took their seats. Malik couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He glanced around the room, catching sight of Jamal, who gave him a nod. Jamal's eyes seemed heavy, almost as if he were trying to hold back something. Mr. Thompson entered the room a few minutes later, his usual gruff demeanor replaced by a look of barely contained frustration. He didn't greet the class like he usually did, instead moving straight to the chalkboard without a word. "Class," Mr. Thompson began, his voice hard and sharp. "We've got a serious issue." The room fell silent. Malik's heart began to race. What was going on? "Earlier today," Mr. Thompson continued, his eyes scanning the room, "the administration informed me that they've been reviewing the results of the science fair. And apparently, there are some concerns regarding Malik's project." A chill ran down Malik's spine. He glanced over at Jamal, whose expression had turned serious. Something was happening, something he couldn't quite understand yet. "What concerns?" Malik finally spoke, his voice clear but slightly trembling. His eyes locked with Mr. Thompson's. Mr. Thompson paused, his gaze lingering on Malik for a moment longer than necessary. "There are rumors, just rumors, that your project was, well, influenced by someone else. Some people believe that you didn't actually create it on your own." Malik felt as though the room had been punched in the gut. The words didn't register at first, and for a brief moment, he couldn't process the situation. "Wait," Malik said, shaking his head, trying to regain control of his thoughts. "Are you saying I didn't do my own work?" Mr. Thompson didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to the class, addressing everyone. "I don't want to jump to conclusions, but we need to take a closer look at things. The administration is questioning the legitimacy of the project, and they've asked me to investigate." The room erupted into murmurs. Malik could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, some filled with doubt, others with pity. For a moment, everything felt surreal. The pride he'd felt just a few days ago, after winning the science fair, had suddenly been replaced with an overwhelming sense of disbelief. How could anyone think that he hadn't worked on the project himself? How could anyone assume that he had cheated? It wasn't just about the unfairness of it all, it was about something deeper. This moment, this accusation, felt like it was going to strip away everything he had worked so hard for. It felt like the one thing that had allowed him to start seeing his potential was being ripped away. As the bell rang and the class shuffled out, Malik remained seated, his mind racing. He didn't know what to do. His victory was being questioned, and he couldn't find a way to prove the truth. How could he defend his hard work when the people around him were already making assumptions? Jamal stayed behind as well, walking over to Malik's desk. "Yo, man," he started, his voice filled with concern. "This is messed up. I know you did that project yourself. But this whole thing, it doesn't feel right." Malik stared at the desk, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the surface. "I don't know what to do, Jamal. I don't even know how to explain it. It's like all that progress I've made, all that confidence, is just slipping away." Jamal placed a hand on Malik's shoulder, offering a rare moment of support. "You've come too far to let this get to you. Don't let them take away what you've worked for." Malik nodded slowly, but the doubt still lingered. He had no idea who might have started the rumors or why anyone would target him like this. But one thing was clear, he wasn't about to let anyone destroy the progress he had made. Not now, not when he had finally found his own strength. That night, Malik stayed up late, staring at his project on his desk. He wanted to rip it apart, to tear it into pieces because the weight of the accusations made him feel like it didn't even matter anymore. But deep down, Malik knew that wasn't the answer. He had to fight. Not just for the science fair project, but for everything he had worked to build, his self-confidence, his identity, and his belief that he was capable of more than what people expected of him. He didn't care about the whispers, the rumors, or the unfairness. What mattered was that he knew the truth, and he was determined to prove it. The next morning, as Malik walked into school, he felt a sense of resolve that hadn't been there before. The doubt that had clouded his mind the night before was still there, but he wasn't going to let it control him. He walked into the classroom, ready to face whatever was coming next. He was determined to show everyone, especially Mr. Thompson, that he was capable of so much more than they had ever given him credit for. He wasn't going to let this accusation define him. He was going to make them see the real Malik Carter. And he was going to do it on his terms. The tension in the air felt even thicker the next day. Malik walked through the school halls, feeling as though every pair of eyes was on him. Whispers followed him wherever he went, some laced with judgment, others with curiosity. His classmates had all heard the rumors, and the uncertainty that hovered over him made his stomach churn. As he walked into Mr. Thompson's classroom, he was greeted by the usual murmur of chatter that accompanied the start of class. But today, it was different. There was a strange undercurrent to the conversations. Some students avoided eye contact, while others shot him pitying glances. Malik wasn't sure what hurt more, the rumors that were floating around or the fact that his classmates seemed to think he was guilty without even asking him for his side of the story. Mr. Thompson stood at the front of the classroom, pacing back and forth, his expression grim. When the bell rang and the room settled into silence, he addressed the class in his usual clipped tone. "I know there's been a lot of talk around here recently," he said, his eyes briefly landing on Malik. "But we're going to get to the bottom of this. The administration wants answers, and they want them quickly." Malik's hands tightened into fists at his sides, and he fought to keep his composure. He didn't want to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him shaken. He'd come this far, and he wasn't about to let them tear him down now. Mr. Thompson turned his attention to the class, his voice gaining a more serious edge. "Now, I know Malik has been through a lot, but I need to make it clear, I will not tolerate cheating in this classroom. If you've done something to compromise the integrity of the project, you will be held accountable." Malik felt the weight of his teacher's words like a slap in the face. Mr. Thompson had always been the teacher who didn't care about anything outside the classroom, his attitude was indifferent, at best. But now, he was treating Malik as if he were a criminal. It stung, especially after everything Malik had worked so hard for. Jamal, who had been sitting beside Malik, leaned over to him. "Don't let this get to you, man. You know you didn't cheat." Malik nodded, his thoughts racing. He didn't care what anyone thought, he knew the truth. But he needed to prove it. The rest of the class was a blur. As soon as the bell rang, signaling the end of the period, Malik gathered his things and hurried out the door, not wanting to deal with the hushed whispers that followed him through the hallways. He had to do something. He couldn't just sit back and let this destroy everything he had worked for. He didn't even know who had started the rumors, but it didn't matter. He was going to find out, and he was going to clear his name. His first step. Go to the science department and ask for an explanation. Later that afternoon, Malik made his way to the science department, where the head of the department, Mrs. Collins, was reviewing some paperwork in her office. He knocked lightly on the door before stepping inside. "Mrs. Collins," he said, his voice firm but respectful. "I need to talk to you about the rumors surrounding my project. I don't understand why this is happening, and I need some answers." Mrs. Collins looked up, a surprised expression crossing her face. "Malik. Of course. What's going on? I've been hearing that my project is being questioned, people are saying I didn't do it myself. But I don't know where this is coming from." Malik's frustration was barely contained, but he kept his tone steady. "I did that project myself, and I've been working on it for weeks. I need to clear my name before it goes any further." Mrs. Collins sat back in her chair, her brow furrowed as she studied him. "I'm not sure where the rumors are coming from either. But I can assure you that I've seen your work firsthand, Malik. I know you've put in the effort, and I believe in your abilities. I'll speak to the administration about this." Malik felt a small sense of relief at her words, but it wasn't enough. The damage had already been done. He couldn't just rely on someone else to fix this. He needed to take control of the situation himself. "Thank you, Mrs. Collins," he said, his resolve hardening. "But I need to do more. I'm going to find out who's spreading these rumors and why they're doing it." She looked at him, her expression softening. "I understand, Malik. Just know that we're here to support you. Don't let this cloud your judgment. You've done the work, and you deserve to have that recognized. Malik nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't going to back down. That night, Malik called Jamal and told him what he was planning to do. I'm going to figure this out, Jamal. I don't know how yet, but I'll get to the bottom of this. It's not just about the project, it's about proving that I'm not the person they think I am. Jamal, as always, was supportive. You got this, man. I know you do. Let me know if you need anything. As Malik hung up the phone, he felt a surge of determination. He wasn't going to let this accusation define him. He was going to take charge and show everyone, his classmates, his teachers, and himself, that he was capable of so much more than they thought. The next day, Malik spent his lunch hour sitting outside, going over everything in his mind. He reviewed the steps he had taken for his project, the hours he had spent working on it, the research he had done, and the ideas that had shaped his final presentation. He knew there was no way anyone could have done the work for him. It was his project, and he could prove it. He spent the afternoon gathering evidence, reviewing the files he had used for his project and even contacting some of the people he had spoken with during the research phase. Slowly, the pieces started to fall into place. It became clear that whoever had spread the rumors had done so out of pure jealousy or resentment, but Malik still had no idea who it was. He needed answers, and he was willing to get them, no matter what it took. As the days passed, the pressure continued to mount, but Malik remained determined. He knew that the truth would come out eventually. The only question was, who would it come from? But one thing was for sure, he wasn't going to let this setback define him. He was going to fight for his name, for the work he had done, and for the confidence he had finally started to build. He was going to take the next step in his journey, no matter how tough the road ahead might be. Malik spent the next few days running on adrenaline. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this determined, this focused. Every moment he wasn't in class, he was searching for answers. The rumors about his science fair project still hung over him like a cloud, and he couldn't rest until he knew who was behind them, and why. He had always been a quiet kid, the kind who preferred to observe rather than get involved in the drama. But now, something inside him had shifted. He couldn't just let this go. Not this time. That Thursday afternoon, Malik made his way to the library after school. The quiet hum of students working on their assignments filled the space, but Malik barely noticed. He was only focused on one thing, getting to the bottom of the rumors. He had a theory. A small part of him couldn't shake the suspicion that the person who had started the rumors was someone who felt threatened by his sudden success, someone who wanted to tear him down to feel better about their own shortcomings. But he needed proof, and Malik wasn't about to jump to conclusions without it. After sitting down at a corner table, he pulled out his laptop and began sifting through his files. He started with the project itself, reviewing every step of the process. His notes were meticulous, the research detailed. Nothing seemed out of place. But something nagged at him. He had a gut feeling that the key to cracking this mystery was buried within the connections he'd made during the project. He just needed to connect the dots. Malik opened his contacts list and began scrolling through the people he had worked with, both teachers and students. There was Mrs. Collins, who had been a huge support throughout the project, and there was also Jamal, who had helped him test out some of his experiments. But beyond them, there were a handful of classmates who had seen him putting in the hours in the library and at home. None of them had raised any questions when Malik had shared his ideas. They had all been supportive. That's when it hit him. Marcus. Malik's mind flashed back to the day of the science fair. Marcus had been there, his eyes narrowing with every moment that Malik's project received more attention. They had shared a few classes together, but Marcus had always kept his distance. Malik had assumed it was just his quiet nature, but now Malik wasn't so sure. He hadn't spoken much with Marcus, but he had overheard him talking about his own science fair project a few days before the event. Marcus had been furious when he didn't win, muttering under his breath about how unfair it was. But what if it wasn't just jealousy? What if he had done something more? Determined to find out, Malik pulled up Marcus's social media account. Sure enough, he found a few posts that seemed a little too close to home. One in particular stood out. It was a comment on a science-related post from a week before the fair. Some projects just seem too good to be true, Marcus had written. They make you wonder what's really going on behind the scenes. It was subtle, but the timing was telling. Malik's blood ran cold. Could Marcus have been planting seeds of doubt, trying to sabotage his hard work? He wasn't sure, but he was starting to piece together a picture. That evening, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the verge of discovering something big. He had to confront Marcus, but he needed to be careful. If Marcus was the one behind the rumors, Malik didn't want to give him any reason to deny it or make things worse. The next day, Malik found himself sitting in the cafeteria, scanning the room for Marcus. He spotted him at a table in the back corner, laughing with a group of students. Malik's pulse quickened. This was it. He took a deep breath and walked over to the table. As he approached, Marcus looked up, a smirk spreading across his face as he noticed Malik. Well, Marcus said, leaning back in his chair, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Look who it is. The star of the science fair. Got your trophy shining bright, huh? Malik stood his ground. I need to talk to you, Marcus. About the rumors. About my project. The smirk faded from Marcus's face, and for the first time, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. What rumors? You know exactly what rumors. About me not doing my own work, Malik said, his voice steady. Did you start them? Marcus hesitated, but only for a second. He glanced at the other students at the table, who were now watching the conversation with interest. Finally, he leaned forward, lowering his voice so only Malik could hear. I didn't start the rumors, if that's what you're asking, Marcus said, his tone cold. But let's be real. You didn't deserve to win that science fair. You don't even belong in the same league as me. Malik's heart raced, but he refused to let Marcus's words rattle him. So, you think spreading lies is going to make you feel better about not winning? Malik asked, his voice calm but filled with quiet fury. That's pathetic, Marcus. Marcus's eyes narrowed. You really think you're the first person who's had their project stolen? It happens all the time. You think you're the only one who's been working hard? You're not the special one here. Malik clenched his fists, but he took a deep breath. He had to stay focused. He wasn't going to let Marcus get under his skin. Not today. I didn't steal anything, Malik said, his voice low and steady. And you're not going to take my victory away from me. Not this time. There was a long silence between them, the tension thick in the air. Marcus stared at Malik, his face flushed with anger. But then, he did something unexpected. He chuckled, low and quiet, almost to himself. Whatever, man, Marcus muttered, shaking his head. You think you've got it all figured out. But I know what I know. Malik didn't respond. He turned and walked away, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't need Marcus's admission. He didn't need any more confirmation. Malik had learned everything he needed to know. Marcus was behind the rumors. And now, Malik had the truth. And he wasn't about to let anyone take that away from him. Malik woke up the next morning with a sense of purpose, but the weight of the task ahead hung heavily on him. He had the truth now, he knew Marcus was behind the rumors. But knowing wasn't enough. He needed to make sure it was addressed, and he needed to make sure the lies didn't overshadow everything he'd worked for. The first step was to speak with Mrs. Collins. Malik needed to approach this carefully. He didn't want to make accusations without proof, but he also didn't want to let Marcus's actions slide. This wasn't just about one project, it was about standing up for what was right. After school, Malik found himself outside Mrs. Collins's office again, the hallway empty except for a few students hurrying to their next class. He knocked on the door and entered when she waved him in. "Malik, what's on your mind today?" she asked, looking up from her desk, her expression warm. "I need your help," Malik said, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "There's something important we need to discuss. It's about the rumors surrounding my science project." Mrs. Collins raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Go on." Malik took a deep breath before continuing. "I've figured out who started the rumors. It's Marcus. He's the one who's been spreading lies about me cheating on my project." Mrs. Collins didn't look surprised, but Malik saw her jaw tighten. "And how do you know this?" she asked carefully. "I've been looking into it," Malik replied. "I found evidence. Marcus has been making comments online about how some projects seem too good to be true. And he's been talking down about me ever since I won the science fair." Mrs. Collins sat back in her chair, considering what Malik had said. "This is serious, Malik. If Marcus is really behind this, we need to take action. But we have to be sure, and we need proof." Malik nodded. "I understand. But I've been trying to find the right way to handle it. I don't want to accuse him without being absolutely sure." She gave him an understanding look. "It's a tough situation. But I'll help you get the ball rolling. We'll make sure the truth is heard." For the first time in days, Malik felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this could be resolved. Maybe he wouldn't be defined by the lies Marcus had spread. The next day, Malik and Mrs. Collins met with the principal, Mr. Reed. Malik recounted everything, how he had worked tirelessly on his project, how the rumors had started to circulate, and how he had discovered that Marcus was behind the accusations. Mr. Reed listened attentively, his expression unreadable. When Malik finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "This is a serious matter," Mr. Reed said, his voice measured. "We take academic integrity seriously at this school, and we cannot allow any student to undermine the hard work of others." Malik's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the moment that could change everything. "We'll conduct a formal investigation," Mr. Reed continued. "But you need to understand that it might take some time. We'll need evidence to move forward." Malik nodded. He knew this wasn't going to be an easy road. But he wasn't backing down. Not now. Over the next few days, the investigation unfolded slowly. Malik provided the evidence he had gathered, including screenshots of Marcus's social media posts, along with his own research that proved his project had been entirely his work. Mrs. Collins vouched for him, as did Jamal, who had been by his side throughout the process. The tension was unbearable. Every time Malik walked into school, he felt eyes on him, whispers, side glances, and judgment from students who had already made up their minds. But he refused to let it break him. He knew the truth, and that was enough for him to hold his head high. One afternoon, Malik was called into Mr. Reed's office. Mrs. Collins was already there, along with Jamal. Malik's stomach tightened as he sat down, awaiting the news. "Malik," Mr. Reed began, "after reviewing the evidence, we've come to a conclusion. Marcus will be disciplined for spreading false accusations. While we can't undo the damage caused, we will ensure that his actions are addressed." Malik felt a weight lift off his shoulders, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of disbelief. "You mean, you believe me?" "Of course we believe you," Mr. Reed said. "We've seen the evidence. And we know the kind of student you are. This is about more than just a project, it's about the integrity of the entire academic community here." Malik didn't know what to say. For a moment, he felt like he might collapse from the relief. He had fought so hard for this, and now, it was finally paying off. The next few days at school felt like a blur. The rumors that had once haunted Malik began to die down, replaced by a growing respect from his peers. Even those who had been skeptical now seemed to understand the truth. But it wasn't just the rumors that had changed. Malik had changed, too. He was no longer the quiet student who kept to himself. He had found his voice, and he was ready to use it. He stood in front of the class the next week, giving a presentation about the science project that had nearly cost him everything. He talked not just about the science behind the project, but about the lessons he had learned through the entire experience, the importance of perseverance, the value of standing up for what's right, and the power of resilience. By the end of the presentation, the class was silent. When Malik finished, there was a brief pause before the applause started. It wasn't just polite clapping, it was genuine, heartfelt recognition of everything Malik had overcome. Malik smiled, feeling an overwhelming sense of pride. This wasn't just about winning a science fair anymore. It was about proving to himself that he was capable of more than he had ever realized. Malik walked into school the next Monday with a sense of calm that he hadn't felt in a long time. The previous week had been a whirlwind, dealing with Marcus's false accusations, confronting him, and watching the school's administration take action, but now, there was a peace settling over him. The pressure had lifted, and though the scars of the ordeal still lingered, Malik had emerged stronger than before. As he made his way to his locker, a few students waved at him, some offering encouraging smiles. Word had spread quickly about how Malik had stood up for himself, and the respect he had gained was palpable. No one seemed to care about the rumors anymore. What mattered was the truth, and Malik had proven that he was more than capable of standing by it. "Hey, Malik." Jamal's voice called out as he approached. Malik grinned. "What's up, man?" Jamal gave him a fist bump. "Just wanted to check in. You good?" "Yeah, I'm good. Just, taking it all in, you know." Malik shrugged, still processing everything that had happened. "It's been a crazy couple of weeks, but I think I'm finally starting to breathe again." "I hear you," Jamal said, his smile widening. "You did something a lot of people wouldn't have been brave enough to do. People are talking about it, man. You showed them what you're made of." Malik chuckled, feeling a warmth spread in his chest. "Yeah, I guess I did. I didn't expect it to turn out like this, but I'm glad it did." As they walked toward their next class, Malik couldn't help but reflect on everything that had brought him to this moment. It wasn't just the victory in the science fair or the public validation, it was about the journey. About finding strength when he didn't think he had any left. About realizing that sometimes, the hardest battles were the ones that taught you the most about yourself. But there was still one thing left to do. Later that day, Malik found himself standing outside the principal's office once again. This time, it wasn't for a meeting about the rumors or an investigation. He had something important to say, something he needed to get off his chest. As he entered the office, Mr. Reed greeted him with a nod. "Malik, what's on your mind?" "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened with Marcus," Malik said, sitting down across from the principal. "And I just wanted to say thank you. For taking me seriously. For supporting me." Mr. Reed smiled. "You handled yourself with maturity, Malik. Not many students would have had the courage to do what you did. It wasn't just about clearing your name, it was about standing up for yourself and for what's right." Malik shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I know it wasn't easy. And I don't want anyone to think I'm looking for sympathy. I don't want the whole thing to be forgotten. I want it to mean something." Mr. Reed's expression softened. "What you did mattered, Malik. It sent a message, not just to the students here, but to everyone who heard your story. You showed that it's important to fight for what's fair and to stand up for yourself, even when it feels like the world is against you." Malik nodded, feeling the weight of his words sink in. "I just don't want anyone else to feel like they're alone. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that you can't stay silent when something's wrong." Mr. Reed leaned forward, his tone sincere. "You've learned a valuable lesson, Malik. And I'm proud of you for it. You've become a role model for others." Malik smiled, his heart swelling with pride. He had come a long way from the shy, uncertain kid who had walked into this school just a few months ago. But now, he was ready to embrace whatever came next. The following week, Malik was invited to speak at an assembly. It was a huge honor, and although he was nervous, he knew he couldn't pass up the opportunity. Standing in front of the entire school, Malik felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. This was his chance to share his story, to make sure the lesson he had learned didn't end with him. When his turn came, he walked to the podium, his hands slightly trembling. The room fell silent as he cleared his throat. "Hey, everyone," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm Malik, and I want to share a little bit about what I've learned over the past few weeks. Some of you may have heard about the rumors that went around about me and my science project. And honestly, it was one of the hardest things I've ever gone through. But it wasn't the rumors that hurt me, it was the feeling of not being believed." He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. "The thing is, I didn't give up. I knew who I was, and I knew what I had done. I realized that no matter what anyone said, the truth would always be my side. But not everyone is as lucky as I was. Not everyone has someone to stand by them, to help them fight for the truth." Malik looked out over the crowd, meeting the eyes of some of his classmates who had been there when the rumors first started. "I want everyone to know this: if you're ever in a situation where you feel like no one is listening, or if you're facing something unfair, don't stay silent. Speak up. Fight for yourself. You have more strength than you realize." The room was silent for a moment before applause erupted. Malik's heart pounded, but the cheers didn't just fill him with pride, they reminded him of how far he'd come. As the weeks went on, life slowly began to return to normal for Malik. The rumors died down completely, replaced by respect and admiration from those who had once doubted him. He continued to focus on his studies, but now, there was a new sense of confidence in the way he approached life. But more than that, Malik had discovered something about himself. He had learned that no matter what challenges came his way, he would always find a way to overcome them. And he would never let anyone's opinion define his worth again. With each new day, Malik's future seemed brighter than ever. He had faced adversity, found his voice, and emerged victorious. And though his journey was far from over, he knew one thing for sure: the best was yet to come. The days following Malik's speech at the assembly were a whirlwind of newfound respect and camaraderie. He had given a piece of himself to the entire school, and in return, the school gave him something he hadn't expected: true validation. Students who once kept their distance were now engaging with him in ways that felt authentic. The whispers that had once surrounded his name faded, replaced by genuine conversations and friendship. Even Marcus, the person who had instigated the rumors, seemed to retreat. Malik wasn't sure if it was because he'd been caught or because he had finally realized the impact of his actions, but the tension between them had disappeared. It was a relief, but Malik didn't let his guard down completely. After all, some wounds were still healing. One afternoon, as Malik sat in the school library studying for an upcoming math test, he noticed a familiar face standing by the entrance: Jamal. Malik smiled and waved him over. "Yo, what's up?" Jamal said, settling into the chair next to him. He had an easy grin on his face, but Malik could tell he was about to drop something serious. "Not much, just trying to make sense of this math stuff." "You know how it is," Malik replied, pointing to his open notebook, where equations seemed to taunt him. "What's going on?" Jamal leaned in, his expression becoming more focused. "Listen, man, I've been thinking. You know how you've been helping everyone see what you're really about? You've been putting in work, fighting for what's right. That stuff's admirable, right?" Malik raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the tone of Jamal's voice. "Yeah, thanks. It's been a lot. But I'm glad it's over." I feel like I'm finally getting my life back. Well, Jamal hesitated for a second. It's not over, though. You've made a real impact on people. You've changed things for a lot of us. You've got something special, Malik. I don't think you realize just how powerful your voice is. Malik sat up, surprised by Jamal's words. What do you mean? I've just been trying to clear my name and make sure the truth gets out. Jamal nodded, his eyes intent. But you did more than that. You've been through a lot. You've had people doubt you, spread lies, make you feel small, and yet you came out on top. That's what's powerful. You don't just stand up for yourself, you stand up for others too. Malik felt a warmth spread in his chest. I didn't do it for a reward. I just wanted people to know the truth, Yeah, I get it, Jamal said, but it's bigger than that now. You've got the kind of strength people admire. People who are going through stuff like you did, they look at you and see hope. That's why I think you need to keep pushing forward. You've got the power to change things, Malik. Not just for you, but for everyone who's ever felt like they didn't have a voice. The weight of Jamal's words settled in, and Malik felt something inside him stir. For the first time, he began to realize that his fight wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the people who didn't have the courage to speak out, the ones who were quietly struggling like he had. If he could make a difference for them, why shouldn't he try? All right, man. I hear you, Malik said, his voice steady but with a newfound determination. Maybe it's time to start thinking bigger. I'm not done yet. Not by a long shot. Malik's decision to push forward was solidified the next week when he received an invitation to speak at a leadership conference for high school students. It was a huge opportunity, an invitation extended by none other than Mrs. Collins. She had seen potential in Malik's ability to inspire others, and now she wanted him to take that next step. The idea of standing in front of a room full of accomplished students and educators was nerve-wracking, but Malik couldn't ignore the growing sense of purpose that came with the opportunity. He wasn't just the student who had fought against rumors anymore. He was becoming a symbol of resilience, of pushing past adversity no matter how hard it seemed. As the day of the conference drew closer, Malik worked tirelessly on his speech. He didn't want it to be just another presentation. He wanted it to matter. He wanted the people in the audience to hear his story and feel like they could do something with it. The night before the conference, Malik sat at his desk in his room, rereading the speech he had written. It was a mixture of reflection, lessons learned, and hope for the future. There were a few parts that made him choke up, but he reminded himself that those moments were the most real. The truth had to be raw and unfiltered. The next day, Malik stood backstage in a large auditorium filled with students from different schools. He could hear the buzz of conversations, the murmur of excited voices, but all of it felt distant. He was in his own world, focused on the speech in his hand. Mrs. Collins, who had been instrumental in helping Malik prepare, approached him just before he was called to the stage. "You've got this, Malik. Just speak from the heart. Don't worry about anything else. This is your moment." Malik gave her a small smile, grateful for her support. "Thanks. I'm nervous, but I think I'm ready." "You're more than ready," she said with confidence. When Malik was finally introduced, he took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. The spotlight felt blinding, but his legs moved without hesitation. He stood in front of the podium, his palms sweating but his heart steady. The audience fell silent, waiting for him to speak. Malik cleared his throat. "Hello, everyone. My name is Malik, and I'm here today because I believe in the power of resilience. I've been through a lot to get to this point, and I want to share that journey with you." As he began to speak, the words flowed more easily than he had imagined. He talked about his struggles, his fight against the false accusations, and how it had changed him. He spoke about the importance of standing up for oneself, even when the world seems determined to tear you down. He talked about how he had learned that the hardest challenges often lead to the most rewarding victories. And as he spoke, Malik felt a shift within him, a deeper understanding of his own power. He wasn't just a student, he was a force. He was someone who could help others see their own strength, too. The room was silent as he finished, but the applause that followed was overwhelming. Malik had shared his story with the world, and in doing so, he had inspired others to keep going, no matter what obstacles lay ahead. As he left the stage, Mrs. Collins met him with a proud smile. "I knew you could do it," she said, her voice filled with admiration. Malik grinned back. "I couldn't have done it without you. This is just the beginning." Malik couldn't remember the last time he felt so alive. The overwhelming applause from his speech at the leadership conference still echoed in his mind, but it wasn't the applause that kept him awake at night. It was the feeling of having made an impact. Of knowing that his words had reached beyond his school, beyond his community. People were listening, and they were taking action. In the days following the conference, Malik received a flood of messages from students across the state. Some thanked him for sharing his story, others confessed that they were going through similar struggles and didn't know how to stand up for themselves. One message in particular stood out to him. It was from a girl named Layla, a student from another high school, who wrote, "Your story inspired me to speak up about something that's been happening at my school. I've been bullied for years, and I've never had the courage to tell anyone. After hearing your speech, I realized I deserve better. Thank you for showing me that I have a voice." Malik felt a wave of emotion reading her words. It was one thing to inspire his classmates, but to know he had affected someone miles away, a complete stranger, was something else entirely. Layla's message wasn't the only one he received. Many others shared similar stories, and Malik found himself connecting with people he'd never met, people who had faced adversity in their own lives and needed someone to remind them that they weren't alone. For Malik, these connections were a reminder of why he had chosen to speak out in the first place. It wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about creating a space for others to be heard. A space where people could stand up, share their stories, and find solidarity in one another. One afternoon, as Malik was sitting in the cafeteria, Jamal walked up to his table, a serious look on his face. "Yo, Malik, got a minute?" Jamal asked, sitting down across from him. "Yeah, what's up?" Malik replied, looking up from his lunch. "I was talking to my mom last night, and something she said really stuck with me," Jamal began. "She said that we've been given a platform now. People are paying attention to what you're doing. And that's not something you can just walk away from." Malik raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've got this opportunity to help more people than just us in the school. You've got the power to reach out beyond our little world here. Have you thought about what you could do next? I'm not saying you've got to start some big non-profit or anything like that, but there's definitely something bigger you could be a part of." Malik paused, turning the idea over in his mind. He had been so focused on getting through the rumors and finding his own voice, he hadn't really considered what came after. Could he really make an even bigger impact? Could his story do more than just inspire people? It could give them a way to take action. "I don't know, man," Malik replied slowly, his brow furrowing. "I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do next. I feel like I've done what I can for now." Jamal leaned forward, his eyes locked onto Malik's. "You've got a real gift, Malik. You're changing people's lives, just by sharing your story. I think you should think about it, how you can keep that momentum going." The idea gnawed at Malik for days. Could he really do something on a larger scale? He wasn't sure where to start, but the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. Malik didn't just want to be a voice in the crowd, he wanted to start a movement where students like Layla and others could come together and speak out against injustice, bullying, and inequality. Malik sat down at his desk late one night, the glow of his laptop illuminating his face. He opened a new document, the cursor blinking on the blank page. What was he supposed to say to start? How could he reach out to others the way he had been reached out to? His fingers hovered over the keyboard, and then the words came. It's time to be heard. No matter where you're from, no matter what you've been through, you have a voice. And your voice matters. We are more than the labels that others place on us. We are more than the things that try to keep us silent. It's time to stand up, speak out, and change the world around us, together. Malik paused, reading over the words. There it was. He had started. The next step was to spread the message, whether it was through social media, hosting events, or connecting with other students across the country. He needed to take this first step and make it count. The next few weeks were a blur. Malik and Jamal began organizing small events at school, inviting speakers, and offering students a platform to share their stories. Word of their initiative spread quickly, and soon, other schools in the district were reaching out, asking how they could get involved. The ripple effect was growing, and Malik was both amazed and humbled by the response. He had started with the simple desire to clear his name, but now, Malik had become the catalyst for something much larger, a movement of students speaking out against the things that silenced them. But even with all the success, Malik knew he couldn't stop there. His mission was far from over. There were still so many voices that hadn't been heard, so many stories that hadn't been shared. He wasn't going to stop until everyone had a chance to speak their truth, until no one felt like they had to suffer in silence. A month later, as Malik walked down the hall at school, he passed a bulletin board where a flyer caught his attention. It was for an event titled Voices United, a student-led rally promoting self-expression, anti-bullying, and equality. The flyer had Malik's name on it as one of the main organizers. He smiled to himself, feeling the weight of what they had accomplished. This wasn't just his story anymore, it was everyone's story. And that was the most powerful thing of all. The success of the Voices United rally was nothing short of incredible. The turnout was massive, with hundreds of students from various schools coming together to share their stories. The event wasn't just a protest or a movement, it was a celebration of the power of self-expression. Malik had seen firsthand how much a single voice could change the narrative, and now, he was witnessing it on a much larger scale. For the first time, Malik didn't feel like the underdog. He wasn't fighting against a system that had failed him, or a community that doubted him. He was part of a collective force, a movement that had outgrown him and had started taking on a life of its own. However, while everything seemed to be coming together, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was brewing. There were whispers behind the scenes, some that made him uneasy. He had heard that the school board had started noticing the attention his efforts were garnering. And with that attention came both support and resistance. One afternoon, Malik was sitting with Jamal in their usual corner of the library, going over the plans for their next event. Malik had noticed that Jamal seemed distant lately, his mind seemingly preoccupied. "Jamal, what's up with you?" Malik asked, closing his notebook and setting it down on the table. "You've been kind of quiet." Jamal hesitated before looking up. His face was tense, and his jaw was set in that way Malik had come to recognize when something was weighing on his friend. "I've been hearing some stuff," Jamal said, his voice low. "About the school board. They don't like how much attention this movement is getting. They're talking about making things harder for you." Malik felt a tightness in his chest. He had expected pushback, but hearing it from Jamal made it feel real. "What kind of stuff?" "They're talking about shutting down the events. They want to put limits on the things we can say at these rallies. They're even suggesting that you might be stirring up trouble or creating division," Jamal continued, his voice full of concern. "I don't know what's going to happen next, Malik." Malik leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He had known that his actions would challenge the status quo, but he hadn't anticipated that it would lead to this kind of resistance. The thought that his voice was being labeled as trouble stung, but it also lit a fire inside him. "If they think they can silence me, they're wrong," Malik said quietly, but with conviction. This is bigger than just me or this school. It's about people who've been made to feel like they don't matter. If they want to shut us down, they'll have to go through every single one of us. Jamal nodded, but his expression remained concerned. Just be careful, man. This could get ugly. Malik didn't have the luxury of hesitation. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. He stood up, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. Thanks for the heads up. But I'm not backing down, Malik said, his voice steady. We'll handle this. Together. The following week, Malik found himself at a school board meeting, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment he had been dreading, the confrontation between the movement he had started and the institutional forces that were trying to shut it down. He walked into the room, his hands sweaty but his mind sharp. The school board members sat at their long table, some looking stern, others indifferent. Malik's eyes were drawn to the superintendent, a man named Mr. Holloway, who had always been somewhat distant when it came to student issues. Mr. Holloway cleared his throat as he addressed the crowd. We've called this meeting today to discuss the recent events organized by Malik Johnson and his peers. While we commend the enthusiasm and the energy of the students involved, we must also address the concerns raised by some of our community members. Malik felt his stomach tighten. He had anticipated this. But he wasn't going to let fear control him. The superintendent continued. There are growing concerns that these events are becoming increasingly disruptive. Some have even labeled them as divisive, and we believe it's necessary to establish more oversight and potentially place restrictions on what is being said during these rallies. Malik stood up, his legs feeling unsteady at first, but the words came easily. He had prepared for this moment. He had prepared for everything. I understand that change can be uncomfortable, Malik said, his voice carrying through the room. But what you're calling disruption is really just a demand for fairness, for respect, for the same opportunities everyone else gets. We're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for a seat at the table. He paused, making eye contact with the board members, then continued. This isn't about me or about trying to create division. It's about standing up for the people who have been silenced for too long. It's about making sure that when we speak, we are heard. There was a long silence in the room, and for a moment, Malik wondered if they would brush him off, ignore his words and continue with their plans to limit the movement. But then, one of the board members, a woman named Mrs. Peterson, spoke up. I've seen the change that's happening at this school, she said, her voice firm but thoughtful. I've seen students who were once afraid to speak out begin to find their voice. And I've seen the impact it's had on our community. I may not agree with everything that's been said, but I respect the fact that our students are fighting for something they believe in. The room fell quiet, and Malik held his breath. Could this be a turning point? Was someone on his side? Mrs. Peterson turned to Mr. Holloway. I think we need to rethink how we're handling this. The energy here isn't just disruption. It's growth. It's change. And it's time we let it happen. Malik felt a rush of hope surge through him. For the first time, it seemed like the board was actually listening. This wasn't just about following rules or maintaining order, it was about acknowledging that the system needed to change, too. After a tense back and forth, the board finally agreed to allow the rallies to continue, but with some new guidelines in place. They were going to allow students to speak their minds, but they would monitor the content to ensure safety and respect for all. As Malik left the meeting, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. They had won. But this was just the beginning. The ripple effect had only started, and now, the movement had momentum. The victory at the school board meeting felt surreal to Malik. As he walked out of the conference room that day, he could hardly believe that they had won, at least for now. But the victory wasn't just about the rally continuing, it was about something deeper. It was about realizing that they had the power to change the system, not by fighting against it, but by showing it that change was necessary. The following weeks were a whirlwind. The Voices United movement gained more momentum than Malik could have ever imagined. Students from all over the district were reaching out to get involved, creating local chapters, and organizing their own events. Malik's message had gone beyond just his high school. He had inspired an entire generation of young people who were ready to speak out, share their stories, and stand up for what they believed in. And yet, Malik knew this was just the start. The work was far from over. One afternoon, Malik found himself sitting in the principal's office, a letter in front of him. It was from the State Education Board, inviting him to participate in a statewide leadership summit for student activists. Malik's heart raced as he scanned the letter. This was huge. His phone buzzed. A message from Jamal flashed on the screen. "Yo, I just saw that invite. This is it, Malik. You're gonna change the game." Malik chuckled, feeling a surge of excitement. It was one thing to speak at local rallies, but this was an opportunity to reach a larger audience, leaders from all over the state who could help amplify his voice. He leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of everything he had accomplished in the past few months. From the ridicule in the classroom to speaking in front of hundreds of students and now potentially sharing his story on a state platform, Malik had come a long way. But the journey wasn't just about his success, it was about how many others had come along with him. He thought about Layla, the girl who had messaged him after hearing his speech. He thought about the students at the rallies who had shared their own stories, many of them finding strength they didn't know they had. Malik hadn't just changed the way people saw him, he had changed the way people saw themselves. And that was the real victory. The night before the leadership summit, Malik sat at his desk, reviewing his notes. He was nervous, sure, but more than that, he felt a sense of responsibility. This was a chance to do something bigger than he ever thought possible. This was a chance to change the way the system worked, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked or pushed aside. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He thought back to the moment when everything had changed for him, the moment when Mr. Holloway had tried to shut him down. He thought about how terrified he had been, how uncertain of himself he had felt. And yet, here he was, about to speak at a statewide summit, about to inspire an entire room of leaders. He opened his eyes, his mind made up. He wasn't just going to speak. He was going to make them listen. The next day, Malik stood in front of a large group of students, teachers, and community leaders. The room was packed, with people from all walks of life gathered to hear what he had to say. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, but he stood tall, his heart beating with purpose. "Thank you all for having me here today," Malik began, his voice steady. "I stand before you as a student who was once told I wasn't good enough. A student who was told that my voice didn't matter. But I'm not here to talk about me. I'm here to talk about all of us. The students who feel invisible, the voices that have been silenced, the people who are told to wait their turn or sit down and be quiet." Malik paused, letting his words sink in. He could feel the tension in the room, but it wasn't hostile, it was expectant. They were waiting for him to continue, for him to explain why he was there, why this movement mattered. "I'm here to say that we don't have to wait anymore," he continued. "We don't have to be afraid to speak up. We don't have to shrink ourselves to make others feel comfortable. We are worthy of respect, of love, and of opportunity. And if we have to fight for those things, then we will." The room was silent, and for a moment, Malik thought he might have lost them. But then, slowly, the applause began. It started as a small clap, then grew louder and louder until it filled the entire room. People were standing, applauding, not just Malik, but the movement he had sparked. Malik felt tears well up in his eyes. He wasn't sure when he had crossed the line from being a scared student to being a leader, but he realized now that he had. He had become a voice for others, a symbol of resilience and courage. And as the applause died down, Malik smiled. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. After the summit, Malik returned to school with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that there was still a lot of work to be done, but now he had an even clearer vision of what that work would look like. He and Jamal began planning their next steps, organizing workshops and outreach programs to help students develop leadership skills, teach self-advocacy, and create safer, more inclusive environments in schools. But the most important thing Malik had learned through this journey was that change wasn't just about winning battles, it was about building a future where everyone had a chance to speak their truth, to be seen and heard. It was about creating a world where people didn't have to fight for respect, they could simply live in it. As Malik looked out over the schoolyard that afternoon, he realized that the movement he had started had already changed everything. He wasn't just fighting for his future anymore. He was fighting for everyone's. And that was enough. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?